Chapter 3, Mannequin. Amy Pilford was 22, and she and Todd had only been married for about a year. Todd was a deputy with the local sheriff's office here in town. Amy was very pretty and was going to nursing school in a town about an hour drive from the little town that we lived in. She was active in the local Baptist church where she taught Sunday school. It was 3 days after Thanksgiving when she left her and Todd's home to go to the local store at around 9 p.m. It had been snowing all that day, but she had lived here her whole life and she knew how to drive on snowy streets. 2 hours after she had left, Todd began to get a little worried. It was only about 4 miles from their house to the store, and that had been the only place that she was going, she had told him. Todd was off duty, so he hopped in his pickup and drove the 4 miles to the store. It was snowing a little heavier as he turned into the parking lot, and his headlights hit her car sitting there in the parking lot as well. It had been there for a while because the entire windshield and roof of the car were covered in a nice layer of new fallen snow. Todd pulled up next to her car and jumped out. He walked over to her car and opened up the unlocked door. The car was empty. He then closed the door and headed on into the store. "Hey, Todd," the clerk said with a smile as he sat behind the counter watching a small color television. "Hey, Sam, have you seen Amy?" Todd asked as he walked up to the counter. "Sure. She was in here about an hour or so ago," Sam said. "Why? What's up?" "Her car, it's still out in the parking lot, but she's not out there," Todd said as he was becoming more worried. "Really? She was here, but yeah, that was like a while ago," Sam said as he looked down to the counter and then back up. "Yeah, she left." "Was anyone with her, or was she talking to anybody while she was here?" Todd asked as his police mind was beginning to work. "It's been a slow night. The only other person here was Thomas Anderson. I remember because I had to keep an eye on him while I was talking to Amy. He left right before she did." Todd turned around and walked out to his truck where he had a CB. He jumped in the cab as the snow continued to fall as he grabbed the CB. "Judy, you hear me?" "Hey, Todd, what's going on?" crackled the woman's voice across the CB. "Amy's missing. Her car is down here at Sam's, and I can't find her. Sam said that Amy was in here about an hour or so ago. He said the only other person here around the time she was Thomas Anderson." "Radio Michael and have him come down here to the store." "Sure, right away, Todd." By the time it was getting daylight, the store's parking lot was filled with cop cars. There still was no sign of Amy, and no one had seen Thomas Anderson since last night. "Find that son of a bitch Anderson," Todd said as the visible strain of the situation was beginning to show on his face. "He's a doper and a petty thief. Finding him is not a priority," Sheriff Watson stated as he placed a hand on Todd's shoulder. "The priority is finding Amy. It was a cold night, and she could be hurt or disoriented." "I know that piece of shit has something to do with this," Todd shouted out in frustration. 3 miles due east of the store, 2 middle school boys were walking the path through the woods that led from their neighborhood to the local high school. Where the trees end and just about before you come onto the football field, one of the boys saw something over in the new fallen snow. It was lying just off the trail, about 15 feet in among the trees. "What the hell is that?" the boy said as he walked through the snow. "What is it?" the other boy called out to him. The one boy walked up and looked down into a white face staring up at him from its back covered in snow. "I think it's a mannequin." "A what?" the other boy called out as he came bounding over. The first boy knelt down by the body in the snow and removed his gloves. He reached out his hand to brush away the snow from what he thought was the head of a mannequin buried in the snow. As his bare hand touched the face, he knew instantly that this was no mannequin. The boy screamed out as he fell back onto his rear as he quickly scrambled back from the body. "It's a person! It's a person!" he screamed. Her eyes were wide open. They appeared solid black like the eyes of a doll. Her mouth was slightly opened, and it could be seen that her 2 front teeth had been busted out. There was also a large cut on her upper lip. She had been hit in the mouth by something very hard, possibly a flashlight or even a car lug wrench. You couldn't tell because of all the new fallen snow, but after it had been removed, it was easy to see that she had been assaulted and killed at this very spot. Her coat was in a pile over to her right, about 3 feet from her head. Her shirt was ripped open and most of the buttons were missing. Her bra was forced up, exposing both breasts. There were 9 large, jagged wounds covering her chest that appeared to have been inflicted with some type of hunting knife. Her pants were pulled down past her knees, as were her panties. One of her shoes was missing, and it could not be found around the scene. 2 of her fingernails were broken off. Beneath her remaining fingernails, there was debris and what appeared to be the flesh of her attacker. She had been both vaginally and anally raped. The police theorized that her attacker had hit her with a flashlight or lug wrench. He had then brought her out here and raped her in the snow. After he had finished, it was believed she had begun to fight and scratch him. Angered by her fighting back, the killer had just taken out his knife and begun to stab her. One of the stab wounds had severed the aorta, and it had been fatal. Todd was beside himself as he sat in the squad car with tears running down his face. Why did he hit her in the face? She's just a little woman. Why did he have to hurt her like that? Todd cried. We're going to find that bastard, Sheriff Watson assured. How am I going to tell her mother? She fucking died out there in the snow all alone. Was she cold? Was she calling out for me? Todd sobbed painfully. I don't know, Sheriff Watson said as he shook his head. I just don't know. It was fucking Thomas, Todd yelled as he slammed his fist down on the dash of the squad car. We're looking for him. We'll find him, the sheriff said. I'll kill that fucker, Todd swore. I was asleep in a car I'd stolen 3 days earlier about 2 miles outside of town at the roadside park. It was about 2 in the morning and it wasn't snowing anymore like it had been over the past few days. I had left the car running in order to stay warm, but the old clunker had died and I was shaking so much I could barely take it. I was so fucking exhausted. The past few days had been like a daze. I had been drinking heavily and been on a crazy binge. Every time I opened my eyes, they felt like someone had poured ground up glass into them. I was dirty and I smelled like a dead man. At first, the knocks on my window had seemed far away and muted, but after a moment or so, the banging brought me quickly back into the world of the living. I looked over to my left and into the shining light of a policeman's flashlight. Oh well, I thought to myself as I closed my eyes again, at least I'll not freeze to death tonight. A warm jail cell is better than a freezing car. As I unlocked the driver's door, the officer took a step back away from the car. I stepped out into the darkness with sleep in my eyes and my mind all dazed. I know, officer, I began as I closed the door and leaned back against the car. Before I knew what happened, the officer stepped forward and slammed his forearm into my throat, forcing my head back. The man easily outweighed me since I had been on crank for so long. I was like a living zombie. He was pressing his arm so hard into my throat that I couldn't even swallow. I was not trying to fight the officer, but I could not breathe. I reached up and began to force his arm from my throat. As I pushed him back, his hand was already on his gun and it was coming up. All I could think was, stop that gun. I reached down with both my hands and caught the gun as it was coming up. I pushed it to the side, and at that moment I felt a concussion before I heard the shot. I felt the pressure come up, and then quickly within milliseconds there was the boom that caused my ears to immediately begin to ring. My hands were still on the gun, and I never saw his other hand coming over holding the flashlight. Everything went black as the flashlight shattered over the top of my head, and I hit the cold pavement with a smack. When the next time I awoke, my head was aching so bad that the pain was causing my eyes to water. I sat up slowly onto the edge of my cot, and this is when I realized I could not open my left eye. I reached up, and it was then that I felt the dried blood that had ran down the left side of my face while I had laid on my cot. The blood had pooled in my left eye and plastered it shut. Somebody help me, I shouted as I sat on the edge of my cot holding my head. He's awake, I heard as I opened my good eye to see the blurry image of a man standing in front of my cell. Help me, I cried. Shut the fuck up, the officer said as he unlocked the cell and grabbed me by my arm. The officer dragged me down the hallway as I stumbled on my own feet and almost fell twice. He took me to a room and set me down behind a small table. I winced out in pain as I placed my elbows down on the desk as I held my pounding head. A moment later, the door opened and in walked a man who took up a chair positioned on the other side of the table and sat down. He laid a manila folder on the table and then reached over and shook me by the arm. You awake, boy? I cried out. Help me, I think my skull is fractured. You a doctor, boy? Now sit up, I got some questions for you. I sat back, still holding the left side of my head with my hand. I opened my right eye and stared into the face of the older man with a crew cut dressed in the sheriff's uniform. I need a doctor, I pleaded with the man. You almost needed a mortician, the older man said with a chuckle. I couldn't breathe, I stated. The older man sat back in his chair as he crossed his arms. Now that would have been a pity. But I'm glad you're still breathing. You got a world of hurt coming for what you did, son. I stole a fucking car, I said. Yeah, and you did a lot more, the man said as he reached up and opened the manila folder. He flipped open the folder, and the first thing I saw was the face of a dead woman staring up at me. What the fuck? I said. That's right, boy. What the fuck did you do? I reached out and turned over the horrible picture. I don't know nothing about that. You can't even look at her now, huh? Could you look at her while you were raping her? Did you look at her every time you stabbed her? I didn't stab, I stuttered. I don't know. What did you hit her with? You broke out both her front teeth at the gum line. You're a sick fuck, the old man said as his face grew red and his brows furrowed. I didn't do that, I pleaded as I held my aching head. What were you doing at Sam's the other night? Were you there to shoplift? And that's how you came across Amy? Did you just plan to rob her? Or had you been watching her for a while? She was a pretty young girl. Had you been fantasizing about her for a while? Did you plan to kill her, or did it happen because she scratched you and pissed you off? Who the fuck is Amy? I screamed as I slammed my fist down on the desk. It was then that the old man jumped out of his seat and grabbed me by my arm and threw me to the floor. He screamed down at me, "The woman you killed, you son of a bitch!" I didn't kill anyone, I sobbed as I lay on the floor in the fetal position. I was then taken back to my cell and lay there for about 6 hours before they brought a doctor in to check me out and clean up my face. During this time, they also took a blood sample and a scraping from under my fingernails. They photographed me from head to toe and took every kind of sample you can think of. It wasn't until about 4 days later that the gravity of the situation began to sink in. I was coming out of my high by then, and my aching head had begun to subside. A paper was left in my cell when I returned from my shower. I sat down and began to read the article that had been left on my cot for me to discover. It was at that moment that I learned all about Amy Pilford and her horrible murder. I read that Thomas Allen Anderson had been arrested in connection with Amy's murder and that the DA was waiting for forensic evidence to come from the state lab before charges were to be formally charged. I am Thomas Allen Anderson, and it was like I was outside my body reading about another person. As I sat there holding the paper in my hands, staring at the picture, I could not remember that face. She was a very pretty girl with long blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. She had big eyes and a nice smile. I could not remember ever seeing her before. I had been high and drunk for a while now, and sometimes I did black out. Could I have killed her and not even remember it? I looked down at my hands and arms, and sure, there were numerous scratches and wounds. But I was a drunk and I got high. I often woke up covered in my own blood with wounds because I fell when I was drunk. I had even punched my own window out and not remembered doing it. Could I have finally crossed that invisible line and truly became the thing that I feared the most? Was I now the monster that watched me from the woods? I know something had happened out in those woods, but I couldn't remember. Now, had that memory lapse happened again? Is that how my sick mind works? I just black out in the moments of madness? I strained my mind to try and remember the night and those moments. I could remember going into Sam's that night. I had been hungry and I had stolen something to eat. There was a woman there. She was talking with Sam. I went out into the parking lot and it was so cold and it was snowing. I stood there for a moment shaking as I fumbled for the keys in my pocket. The door of the store opened and I heard the crunch of the snow as she walked from the store and passed me to her car. "Miss," I said softly. She turned back and smiled. She had a lovely smile.